Hi, everybody. Welcome to this interview by Core Recruitment. My name is Christian Doyle. I'm the founder at Core, and we're running a leadership interview series across the sectors that we operate in, mostly to inject some positivity into the sectors that we operate in. We've been meeting a whole plethora of different people who are chief executives, inventors, entrepreneurs, investors, and we're getting their take on the market, the segment, and hearing lots of interesting things that they're doing within their companies and organizations. Now, you can listen to these on Spotify, you can watch them on YouTube, or we've got lots of articles on our website as well, which is www.corerecruitment.com. Now, Core's been recruiting now in the Middle East, I'd probably say for around about 15 years, and there's lots of different companies that are doing lots of amazing things in the Middle East, and I am super excited to be meeting Philip Barnes today, who's the Chief Executive Officer for Rotana. Now, in case people aren't entirely aware of who Rotana is, because this goes all out over the world, there's about 115 properties now, I believe, across kind of like multiple different markets, and they're one of the top operators in the Middle East. Now, Philip, I wanted to get started off with a little bit about you and your background and experience. We were just discussing off camera that you were born in a council estate in Manchester, and now you're leading one of the biggest hospitality organizations in the Middle East. Can you just give us a little bit about the company and a little bit about your journey to get us kicked off?
Yeah, well, my mother would probably refer to me as the great imposter on that basis. But anyway, I started my career in the UK. I was lucky enough to work for a company that had four hotels in the United States. And so at the age of about 25, I was presented with the opportunity to go and live in Chicago and into a little luxury hotel there at that time, which then led on to a career with Four Seasons, which lasted over a 10-year period, which took me into the United States, which took me into Canada, and then ultimately down to Singapore and New Zealand. I then subsequently ran a small hotel company for a shipping company out of Singapore that was based in Sydney, Australia, which then led on to my return to North America and joining Fairmont, which is where I spent 24 years of my career. And I worked for Fairmont in Vancouver, in Los Angeles, in London, and here in the Middle East. And then ultimately was approached to return to the Middle East by Rotana, as you mentioned in your introduction. So that's a very, very short description of the whole thing. I just jammed the better part of 50 years into about 45 seconds. But, I just, so we're clear for everybody, it doesn't mean I can't hold a job. It just means that I kept on getting moved. And I was blessed because I did get moved a lot. In my Fairmont days, I specifically worked for our CEO luxury for a Core as it ended up, Chris Cahill. And Chris would always call me when he needed something fixed. So I ended up bouncing around the place. And so that's how I ended up doing a lot of the things that I did. But I've had a phenomenal time, great career, very different from my council house in Manchester.
So I think it's 5 different continents, over 20 different kind of countries that you've been to. I mean, a lot of people will be watching this and looking at your career, Philip, and kind of thinking, wow, that's the type of thing that I aspire to. How did he get himself in front of those people, and how did you have to seek out those opportunities, or did they come to you, or is this just about saying yes to everything that gets put in front of you?
I've been asked that question a few times, and I will say this, that, one of the things that I was always keen to do when there was an opportunity to learn and grow, and somebody would say, who can we find to go and do this? I would frequently stick my hand up and go, I would like to do that. And then once organizations become familiar with the fact that you can be transplanted into different cultures, into different countries, then they tend to come back to you. My move from, for example, Vancouver to the Middle East, the first time round, was a direct result of my boss at the time calling me and saying, Phil, I believe that I've got a great opportunity. I believe you're the right person because you understand different cultures and the way you approach different things. And your family similarly understand those things. Transplanting from culture to culture is not easy because what you cannot do is you cannot get that culture to adapt to you. You have to adapt to them. So if you go into Singapore, for example, and behave like, how would I put it? Behave like a brash American. And I don't mean that as a shot against Americans, but if that's your background and you're American and you go in there thinking, well, this is the way how to do things, then you will come unstuck because people push back on that. One of my biggest challenges, even with Fairmont, was when we were doing the Mecca project, which was a huge project for us, and I was the VP overseeing the project. And every couple of weeks, we'd have a conference call with Toronto on a Sunday morning, and I'd find myself saying things to them for shock value, to remind them of the fact that what we did in Canada and what we did in Toronto does not work in Mecca, does not work in Saudi. Saudi is a very different culture. And so I think it sounds glamorous, but it's not for everybody, because you have to adapt, you have to change, and you have to want to be there, and you have to want to learn, you have to want to grow. And that's, not necessarily the easiest approach, but it's certainly something I've done.
Absolutely. Now, with Rotana, there's obviously a massively strong Emirati heritage, which is kind of there.
Yeah.
You moved over, obviously, from Four Seasons, being kind of like, obviously not from that kind of background. I guess in terms of that culture change and that kind of like, in terms of moving into that type of organization, what did you face?
Look, the Rotana opportunity was, I'll put it in very simple terms. I flew out here. I spent 2 days with the chairman and the vice chairman. And the chairman is Emirati. Rotana is a family-owned business. It's his business. He has other investors in there. And he spent 2 days talking to me about quality. And not just quality in terms of the guest experience, but quality in terms of the colleague experience. Quality in terms of, everything that we do, from the hummus on the buffet right the way through to in-room dining delivery. Now, I've been at that point in time, I'd been in the business for over 4 decades. And I can tell you, I went through a lot of senior executive interviews that were all about numbers and all about finance. And yet here I'm in front of a man who's sitting talking to me about what really makes our business work, which is the guest experience and the colleague experience. Look, the numbers are the direct result of everything else that you do. You don't start with the numbers and work backwards. You start with those other things and work towards that. If you have a hotel that doesn't have a great guest experience and doesn't have happy and excited colleagues, you're never going to win. So for me, that was the interesting part. Having done that, having got here, all right, there was another component which I have to be honest, I knew from my days here before, but it had sort of drifted into the back of my memory banks, which is how important in the Middle East as a whole family is. Family is a critical component, and that's what comes into the culture of the company. For him, it's a question of looking after people because they're staying with us, they're family. And you can say, well, that's, that sounds very, very nice, but it's hard to imagine. But I can tell you, I've been here in the company for about 6 months, and I picked up a chest infection and had to stay home for a few days. I could not stop his daughter from sending me food like 4 times a day. I just couldn't eat it, right? But it was that to her was critically important. I was their CEO. I was family. When you look at the Middle East, when you look at Saudi, when you look at the Emiratis, it's still a very strong component of what goes on in this part of the world, which unfortunately is not in other parts of the world, as you well know. So it was a combination of those two things. And as we're sort of going forward now with Rotana, and we're trying to make sure that we build that into the culture in a variety of different ways. I'll give you a simple example. We have an orientation program for colleagues. It's called Hayakam. Hayakam means welcome, right? And for us, that's critically important. The last thing I want is people standing in the front lobby of a hotel doing the standard greeting. It's got to be something that makes you understand where you are. In the lobby, we also focus on having the scents that are local. We have music that is local. We have coffee and dates that are local. You can't go to an Emirati home and not be offered coffee and dates. It's part and parcel. So it's building that into our culture. When I've been asked in the past to talk about Rotana and what differentiates us from other brands out here, it comes home. It always comes home to me very strongly during Ramadan. At the end of the day in Ramadan, there is an iftar. An iftar is the breaking of fast, and that's when families go out to dinner, friends go out to dinner, everybody goes out to dinner. If you go to an iftar in a Rotana hotel, it will be authentic, it will be genuine, it will be local, because that is predominantly who our teams are. They might not also all be from the Emirates, but they are predominantly from this part of the world. So when we do an iftar, It's very authentic, it's very genuine. And that to me is a critical component of being in hospitality, right?
Excellent. Sticking with that theme of localization, and this is just my experience and some of the people I've met with Rotana as well, but you seem to have done the localization thing from a Saudization and an Emiratization perspective extremely well, kind of like across the group, and it seems to be properly embedded. It doesn't feel like it's just a tick box exercise and it's at all levels within the kind of business. How have you done that, and how do you think that other organizations can learn from your achievement there?
Look, I think, and this is going to probably come out the wrong way, Krishnan, but I don't want you to edit it. All right. Anything that you do in our business, if you don't do it with enthusiasm, energy, and passion, you'll never get anywhere. I get asked the question about sustainability all the time because as the CEO, I suppose I'm supposed to be the mouthpiece of sustainability in every hotel. The truth of the matter is sustainability is not driven by corporate office, it's driven by the hotels. And what we have done is set them up with a mandate to be the best that they can be at being sustainable in their environments. So when, for example, the Beach Rotana decides that they're going to have a beach day cleaning up, where they go out and pick up all the little plastic bits off the beach, they do that of their own initiative. Do we encourage them? Yes. Do we educate them on what's happening in the world of sustainability? Yes. But we don't dictate to them what they do. They're the ones who have to, if they don't own it, if they don't love it, you'll never get anywhere. And the same applies with both Saudization and Emiratization. We have to embrace people coming onto the team. We have to make them feel like they're part of the team. It can feel in a lot of places, in a lot of brands, it can feel like, well, we're doing it because the government requires that we do it. We're not passionate about it. We're not excited about it. Well, guess what? It's never going to work, right? So, to me, that's where the key issue is. Like, I have a lot of Emiratis in the corporate office. We have a lot of Emiratis in the field. And again, it's something that the chairman's passionate about. A few months ago, we had an open morning where we asked the chairman to come along, and we invited all of our Emirati colleagues. We must have had 150 Emirati colleagues in the ballroom at Saudiyat, asking him questions about the hotel business, asking me questions about the hotel business, to engage with them. It's, you've got to be real about it.
100%. Now, coming on to the company and your growth trajectory, the figures do vary kind of like a little bit, but I think in the pipeline, there's 40 plus, which are coming in 20 plus kind of like locations with a big focus on Saudi, I believe, kind of like, for the next couple of years. So I guess in terms of the region and wider than that, where do you see the growth opportunities coming?
All right. Well, many years ago, when I was running Stanford down in Australia, my chairman, God bless him, called me one day to tell me he was buying a hotel in London. I said, that's a wonderful idea, but who's going to look after it? And he said, you are. To which my response was, no, because it took me 24 hours to get from Sydney to London. It wasn't something I wanted to do on a regular basis. So what I'm trying to do is make sure that our growth is within striking distance. So that somewhat limits me, right? In so far as it limits me to the CIS countries, it limits me to the GCC, it limits me to Africa, pretty much most of Africa. I mean, I was down in Congo recently visiting our property in Kinshasa, and that's about an 8-hour flight. That's reasonable. I can get down there for a day, spend a couple of nights there, get back without losing more time than that. So I want to be within striking distance, but I also want to be in key destinations within these cities or within these countries. Sorry. Africa is a prime example. I don't think people are really fully aware of how much China has invested in Africa. It is enormous, and it is a sleeping giant that's going to come to life in the next 10 years. It already is, but it's going to accelerate dramatically. So being in there at this point in time, being in there to establish ourselves, we're already in, as I said, in Congo, we're already in Tanzania and Dar es Salaam. We're already in North Africa and Egypt. And we have other developments. We have a development in Mogadishu. We have a development in Ghana. So we've got a lot of different things going on. Those are, to me, those are where our opportunities lies. My chairman puts it somewhat differently in that he always says to me, Phil, I want to go where the Emiratis go. Now, Now, I agree with him, except then he lumps London into that, and I go, whoa, 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 hang on a minute, right? Because that's a whole different ball of wax. You know, this part, operating in this part of the world is very different. As you know, I was spent 4 years of my life at the Savoy in London. That's a very different experience. So I'm trying to make sure that it fits into our portfolio, that it adds value to our portfolio, that it enhances our portfolio. And at the same time, keep it within striking distance. If I can't get to a hotel in less than 12 hours, it's a problem because
Absolutely.
it's always going to be that situation where I need to get to a hotel quickly. Right?
Absolutely. So we've got a lot of clients who are looking at Africa at the moment, and if I may say, kind of like, with varying degrees of success. What
Yeah.
kind of changes have you made to the concept, your offer, everything to kind of like, to try and be more successful there?
Well, one of the things that I did that I tackled when I first came on board, we had a number of franchise properties. I'm perfectly blunt about it. They were a bit arm's length. And that doesn't work. If you've got a franchise property, it needs to feel like it's a managed property, even though it's not. So we made some pretty significant changes to our operating approach. Our area vice presidents now actually oversee the franchise properties so that they can be in them every 1 to 2 months in the same way they would a managed hotel, that they can engage with the general managers. We do what's called a quarterly business review with the franchise properties. So we've pulled them into the fold, as it were. Having done that, we've embarked on a couple of franchise properties. That one is Onyx, which is in Bahrain, which is open and operating, which is a stunning property and is a market leader. It's a franchise property. It's got a great GM. It's got a great owner. I'll come back to that ownership piece in a second.
Mm-hmm.
We're going into Islamabad, and we're going to have a franchise property there. Why are we doing franchise in Islamabad? Because quite honestly, we don't have the expertise and the knowledge in Pakistan. We can find a management company. We've got a great partner. We can be engaged between. It becomes a three-way tie-up, but we can make it successful as long as we're engaged and as long as we're part and parcel of it. Mogadishu will also be a franchise property. So franchise to me is a great opportunity, but I'll come back to my point about owners. I'm always of the same mind when I sit down with anybody, right? And we're talking about managed, we're talking about franchise. I'm looking at that person from the perspective of how is this partnership going to work? Because it is a partnership, right? In our business, it's always throughout my career, there's always been a lot of people who got into the business because it looked like a great thing to do. And I remember saying to one owner who was with his first hotel, he was so excited on that first day. I said, I hope you feel excited a year from now, because it's a very different business and it's a very complex business, right? I don't think my mother understood that it was more than making a bed and putting bacon and eggs on the table in the morning. It's so complex today, and it continues to be. It's also capitally intensive. There's a lot of challenges, and your profitability levels are significantly lower than those that you would get in other industries. So why do you want to be in the hotel business? And if somebody's going into it with their eyes partially shut, that's a problem, because it's going to be a very rude awakening. I was in front of a developer the other day, a first-time hotel, and they're planning on opening this hotel in about June of next year. And I looked at them and I said, and you haven't appointed a management company as of yet? And they said, no. And I said, this makes me very nervous to be your partner, because you have so much to do in the next 12 months. And I don't think you have any comprehension of what is going to be involved, because people don't. And it's the first time round. So who the owner is as important as whether it's franchised or management. Our owner in Bahrain, for example, is superb. Our owners in Islamabad are superb. That's key.
And that needs to keep going. I completely agree. Now, with the Global Hotel Alliance, you joined in 2025, so you've been in for like just over 12 months now. Can you tell us about what kind of difference that's made? I mean, I know it's been a turbulent year, but has there been any kind of like outstanding changes with that?
And look, it made a difference before it even took off. Everybody kind of questioned me about this in terms of, well, okay, so you've moved to a bigger loyalty program, instead of your domestic one that was less than 1 million members, you've now got 35 million people to talk to. It was more than just the loyalty piece. It was also a very significant positioning piece, because Rotana, as you sort of alluded to very early on, is very much of a Middle Eastern regional brand, and it wasn't known. Okay. Now, my friend Cho Peng Sam, who runs Pan Pacific, could be accused of being the same. He's very much of a regional brand, but because he's part of Global Hotel Alliance, he's perceived in a very different light. And that to me was a key component. It was sending a message to the world at large, right? That Rotana was moving on the world stage in a different way from the way it had done in the past. I'm now talking to members in the UK, I'm talking to members in the US, I'm talking to members in Asia, I'm talking to members in Europe that I didn't have any access to, but I'm talking to them about what it is that we are doing. Before the program had even begun, I started getting calls from people, many of whom I knew in other parts of the world, and organizations that who pay attention to the business, going, "Hey, Phil, you were quiet for a while. Now suddenly you're part of GHA." All of a sudden, we were back on the screen, right? So it really was an important piece. The other piece for it was the development piece. When I sit down and talk to owners, and I can talk to them about having 35 million members in the loyalty program, it's a very different conversation from less than 1 million global within the GCC, which is essentially what I had, right? So there were a lot of different factors that came into play on that. Now, in fairness, my chief operating officer, Eddie, had already started that conversation. He started 6 months before I did. He had started that conversation. But I remember my first conversation with Chris Hartley from GHA, and I said, "Chris, listen, I am predisposed to move forward on this as fast as we can." Still took a bit of maneuvering and getting around, because it's a big transition, but it was well worth it. What I'm looking at already, despite effectively, I'm not going to say 3 months of war, because we're now sort of heading towards 5 months of war, right? Even though you wouldn't honestly, Christian, you wouldn't see it from the numbers, because I think last night in the UAE we ran 72% occupancy. So
Wow.
we're not struggling the way we were in the first month. But despite the impact of the war, we have still seen a significant uptick in business as a result of being part of GHA. And that's in these circumstances. So I'm very optimistic about the future and what we've done there. I think it's going to be a long-term huge benefit to Rotana.
Excellent. Now, obviously, we're a recruitment company, and one of the key things that I always like to hear about from business leaders such as yourself is what you look for when you're selecting either local or international talent who are coming into your organization. Are there particular traits? What's the kind of what makes a great candidate for you?
God, Christian. Where would I begin? I think, to be honest with you, I'm not interested in talking to anybody who's looking for a job. Yeah, that's the first thing that goes through my head. When somebody comes in to see me, my first question, usually, or one of the first, is, why do you want to be here?
Yeah.
Why do you want to take this job? What is it about Rotana that appeals to you? What is it about this environment that appeals to you? And if I don't get the sense of passion, enthusiasm, energy from them in those early stages, it'll be a very short conversation. If you're just looking for a paycheck, you're going to go anywhere. All right. Having said that, when you know that you've got that, then it depends on the role, obviously, but I'm looking for people who have a passion for excellence, because, and this is, I'm sure this is going to create some havoc within some of your listeners, right? But where I'm in an industry that's full of mediocrity, and I say that with no disrespect to anybody. I'm not just talking about hotels. I'm talking about airlines. I'm talking about restaurants. I'm talking about all components of our business. And I look around and I go, why? All right. And it's people. Okay. It's the desire to be the best that you can be. And that has to come from within the individual. If they're happy to let something be okay on delivery, I don't want them around me. I want people who will deliver at the top of their game. I've been blessed in my career. I've been surrounded by some phenomenal people, and who've far smarter than me in their areas of expertise, brought a lot to the table. I feed off them as much as they feed off me. And that's when a team starts to move, when everybody's on the same page, but everybody's focused, everybody's on this journey of excellence. And you say, well, now are you talking about the luxury hotel business? Are you talking about this, that, or that? I'm not talking, I can be talking about your local pub. Okay. Because to me, that's how important it is. And I remember I use that particular analogy because I remember on one, many years ago in my career, I had a pub in the hotel, and it was dreadful. It was awful. And I sat down with the chef and the food and beverage director. I said, I don't care what you got to do, but I want the best pub food. I want the best pub service. I want the best pub environment that you can create. Don't come to me and tell me you're going to put foie gras on the menu or you're going to add, the Chateau Moselle on the wine list. Come to me and tell me what it is that's going to bring people in to make that pub the most successful. If I was to plug against you, Christian, now and say to you, all right, tell me about your favorite restaurant, tell me about your favorite hotel, there will be a culture of excellence in that environment. I guarantee you, okay? And that to me is what matters more than anything else. And it isn't about, as I say, fine dining and China and it's about people caring passionately, right? And that's what I'm looking for on the team. As a general manager, I want to know they've got attention to detail because that drives me out of my mind. I remember I was in a men's room somewhere. It wasn't one of my hotels. And I was picking up bits of paper because they were on the floor. I'm standing there thinking to myself, what am I doing? It's not even my bathroom, right? But I cannot walk by it. And I remember my first GM's job, there was a little sign on the back of the door, and it said, don't walk by any problem, fix it. And that's been my mantra ever since. So if I'm in the restaurant and the server's struggling and I say, what's the problem? And they say, which happened on several occasions, I don't have enough ketchup. My job is to fix it. My job is to go get it. And I want people around me who think the same way. I want people who have that same desire. I classify myself as a servant leader. My job is to take care of the people who take care of the guest, right?
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. So when I rock up at the Savoy and I walk down the hallway to the front door, the little driveway down there, and I walk down to the front door, and Tony's on the door, and he gives me a big hug, I go, this is why it's home. Now I can tell you, he also hugs guests, right? And there's lots of Tonys in the world, and I could rattle off a bunch of names, but I won't.
I love that. Absolutely love that. One thing that we did brush past kind of like a little bit earlier, but like with Rotana, you are the first non-Emirati chief exec to go into the business. It was and is your first chief exec position, having joined from kind of like a senior position within Fairmont. But I guess if you could look back over the next 2 years, last kind of like 2.5 years, and if there were a couple of learnings or a couple of things that surprised you over that period, or advice that you would give to other people to kind of like maybe moving into that type of organization and position, what would that be?
Look, I will tell you what I did, Christian, because it's what I tell everybody to do, and that is what I've always done. The first and the most important thing for you to do in any role, and listen, if you're the front office manager of the ABC Hotel in London, you're the chief executive officer of that front desk. That should be how you perceive yourself. So to me, being called the CEO is purely and simply confirmation of where the responsibility lies. So the buck stops here. But the first and the most important thing, get out, talk to people. Don't just talk to them about what's important to you. Listen to what they have to say. So in my first 6 months here in Abu Dhabi, I went to 70 of our operating hotels. I sat down with the teams. I gave them the same speech that I've been giving for 30 years, right? Which is very simple. I don't pay you, the guest does, which is the message I always like to drive home. And then tell me what works, tell me what doesn't, tell me how things are happening. And then you walk away with an education. And I was getting, as you can probably imagine, I would go into the hotel, I would have, all these opinions that came out of corporate office. And then I would be in the hotel and I'd have all these opinions that came out of the hotel. And I'd come back to the corporate office and I go, okay, guys, you told me this and they told me that. So we have a disconnect here. And it helps you get to grips with where the issues lie. Your job is, in my opinion, as a CEO, yes, it's strategic in nature, but it's also to understand what you've got and where it is that you've got to go. I've identified a number of different areas. Yeah, Global Hotel Alliance is an example. Loyalty. Our approach as a company was very centralized. Why was it centralized? Because we were born in the UAE 33 years ago. We grew up in the UAE. We never needed to. We never felt the need to change from being centrally approached. Well, now I've got 80 hotels operating in 14 countries. I can't have guys sitting here telling the general manager of Istanbul how he should be doing his revenue management. That's a joke, right? So having got out as well and met all the general managers and recognizing that I had talented general managers, but that we were far too involved, it was to come back to the corporate office and say, you need to extricate yourself from what you don't need to be involved in. Your job is to support the hotels. And so I sort of somewhat upended the culture, but it was a direct result of listening to people, talking to people. And I think it's the most important. The advice I gave to somebody who joined us just a few months ago now, this morning, was you need to get out more. You need to be talking more, or talking actually less, and listening more to what it is that people are needing from us. If you're in the corporate office, your job is to support the field. It's not to manage the field. And I've seen organizations. I was blessed. I worked for Four Seasons when we had 25 hotels. I worked for Fairmont when we had 70 hotels. Corporate office was never managing those hotels. They were providing support to them. I look at some companies today. I don't need to name them. You'll be able to name them for yourself. And there's a policy and a procedure and a manual for every single thing. Great, terrific. All right. Except the problem is that the problems, the challenges, the issues don't fit nicely into little boxes. They all come very differently. And you have to have leaders on the ground who can change, move on a dime. I was very proud of all of my GMs during this crisis, because I gave them a very simple mandate in literally day 3. I said, it's very easy. Go after every piece of revenue you can find in order to survive, right? Control your costs the best possible way that you can, and protect your teams. Look after your teams, because this will end. And when it ends, if you have your team intact, even though they might have had to take reduced pay, they might have had to take additional holidays, whatever it may be, but if you have your team intact, right, you will come out of this in flying colors. As I just mentioned to you, we're running 72% in the UAE at the moment. Okay, imagine if we had done what some of our competitors did, which was laid off and made redundant hundreds of people. There's two problems with that. Not just the fact that you can't reopen, but also the damage you've done to your reputation as an employer. Our general managers were brilliant. And you know what they're proudest of? They're proudest of the fact that they didn't have redundancies and layoffs. The hotels are bricks and mortar. That's it. Without people, they don't work.
So I guess, sticking with that trend, I mean, the people, the communication, the culture side of things comes across kind of like really evidently. And this question probably goes more so to recognition and motivation more so, because you won an outstanding award. I think there was the Forbes one. There's been multiple other ones. There's been multiple other ones, which Rotana's kind of picked up as well, both for yourself personally and that as well. But from a recognition perspective, and when you wake up in the morning, kind of and you're focused on what you're going to be doing, what drives you forward and what gives you that spark and that motivation and that drive to lead such a big team and such a big business?
Don't tell Forbes, but giving me an award doesn't really do much for me, right? Don't tell them, because otherwise they'll never give me another one. And my marketing communications guys love it. Listen, I've always said the same thing about our business. It's not what I say about it. It's not what you say about it. It's what the customer says about it.
Yeah.
It's what the guest says. It's what the colleague says. When I have a colleague who says to me, I love working here because of how well I'm taken care of, that's music to my ears. When a guest says to me, I've just had the best stay in this hotel, and this person and that person and the other person really looked after me, that's when you know you're on the winning track. All right. And it's not about getting praise. It's not about getting awards. I think I probably get an email. I get an email every 2 weeks from somebody saying, we want to put you on the cover of ABC magazine, and it's only $5,000 to do so. And I go, I wouldn't pay for it under any circumstances, and it's not something that's important. What matters, as I say, is what the guest says about you. So what I pay attention to is our reputation, is our online reputation, what our guests are saying about us. And I think when you focus on those things, it helps you keep you stay true to what it is you're trying to do. When I went to the Savoy, just to use that as an example, I hadn't even started, and I had already had a couple of conversations with a few of the team members. And one of the things that came out was that the Wi-Fi didn't work in the hotel at the time, didn't work very well at all. And before I'd started, I went to ownership and I said, listen, I'm starting in about a month's time, but I need £250,000. And they go, what for? And I said, because the Wi-Fi doesn't work. I said, and you know it doesn't work because you also stay here. So let's stop messing around and fix the problem. And when we fixed the problem, it was funny because we fixed the problem, and one of the front desk managers came to me one day and she said, I can't thank you enough. And I said, yeah, it's great. And you must have stopped the guest complaints. She said, no, it's not the guest complaints. We couldn't communicate because of the lack of Wi-Fi power. So, it's listening to people, but it's fixing things. It's getting things done. Mm-hmm.
Love that. So for my final question, beyond the kind of room count, beyond the revenue and all of that side of things, like looking ahead for Rotana for the next 30 years, what do you see the vision for the business being from a family perspective?
I think, that's a tough one for me to answer, Krishnan, that the family every family needs to have a very clear plan for what the future looks like. And my recommendation to the chairman and to his family members has been, you really need to have a strategic plan for where you go over the next 10 years. Family businesses, I would say family businesses are the best thing. They're also the worst, okay? Because they have to be aligned about what they're going to do and how they go forward. The chairman has built this company. His daughters are very proud of him. They want to carry it forward. They want Rotana to have a legacy that goes into the future. But the world in which we operate is changing very rapidly. And having been a regional brand for as long as we have, which has been great, but we need to have a very clear plan about where we're going to go. I can talk about development and where I'd like to put hotels without a shadow of a doubt, but there's far more to it than just that development piece and what it is that's involved there, because you've got to continue to invest. And there's some big investments that come along as part and parcel of this. I'll just quickly add that 30 years from now, I won't be around. So, and not that I don't care. I do care very much. I love Sheikha Al Nawaz to death. She's a United Nations tourism person these days, and she's phenomenal. And I know this is a very important thing for her. But I've talked to her and all the family to say, determine what it is you're going to do, but you have to have a plan. Because a lot of what's happened has been very organic, okay? And it can't be organic if you're going to last 30 years, all right? You've got to have a real plan behind it. And that was one of the things for me when I came on board and I was talking to the board, and I said, one of the things that I have to do, and I have to help you do, is develop that strategic plan. Mm-hmm.
That's incredible. Philip, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for your candor throughout. I think from being born in a council estate in Manchester to this is pretty inspirational. So I'm sure a lot of people will take some good learnings from it.
Well, it was very interesting. I was up in Manchester. Well, I was at the Savoy. I was up there. I'll just tell you quickly. I was doing sales calls with one of my team, and I was seeing a key account. And he said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from here." And he said, No. Where are you from? I said, "I'm from here." He said, "This is Salford. Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Salford." And he looked at me, and I'll never forget this. He looked at me and he went, "From Salford to the Savoy. Not bad."